Thank you very much. Let me start by congratulating you all, assuming as I do that you participated in elections, some of you, and that you are elected, and also aware that some of you have been appointed to serve as ministers in the new administration. Congratulations. And also permit me to thank the Office of the Prime Minister for inviting me to share my thoughts with you on a subject that I think is very important, not only to the federal government of Ethiopia, but to the people of Ethiopia and by extension the continent of Africa. My presentation has been summarized in writing and will be available for your reference later. Let me start by saying that the subject of Pan-Africanism is one that remains as important today as it was, in my view, many years ago. Those of you who are familiar with the struggle for Pan-Africanism will remember its story, particularly through the activities of Africans in the diaspora. You'll particularly remember that prior to the much more famous meeting held in 1945 in Manchester in the United Kingdom, Africans in the diaspora, particularly in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Jamaica, were very particular about having connection with the continent of Africa. You'll remember that they had many meetings, and you'll be familiar with some of the names, such as Sylvester Williams from Trinidad and Tobago, such as Marcus Garvey, and his call for Africans to go back to the mother continent. And you will also remember African Americans such as W.B.E. Du Bois, who was very active in the process of liberating the African Americans from the clutches of slavery and discrimination, and who also played a very critical part in the struggle for decolonization, culminating in the 1945 meeting, which for the first time was attended by Africans who later played a critical role in the struggle for decolonization. Of course, Ethiopia does stand out to the extent that it was never successfully colonized. There was limited occupation, and you are familiar with that history. Therefore, it is not mine to educate you on your own history, but you are familiar with it. But it must concern us, particularly at this time. And I hope during this conversation I'll be able to demonstrate why, in order for us to understand the present, we must understand the past, which will also enable us to have a glimpse on what the future holds. And one of the speeches which is seldom referred to is a speech that was delivered in the year 1906 in the month of April by a South African called Pixley Kaisaka Seme. And it is instructive that Pixley Kaisaka Seme was the first president of the African National Congress when it was founded in 1912. When Pixley Kaisaka Seme delivered that speech as a student at the University of Columbia, his title was The Regeneration of Africa. And what he was talking about at that time was an Africa that had borne the brand of slavery and was laboring under the pain of colonization. Pixley Kaisaka Seme reminded his audience on that day that when the European powers assembled in Berlin in 1884 through to 1885, they agreed to divide Africa into spheres of influence for purposes of exploitation, so that the Germans had their share. If you remember, the Germans were present in what we now call Namibia. They were present in what we now call Benin, but was then known as Dahomey. They were present in what is now a part of Ghana, which was then the Togoland, the Volta area. The Belgians were present in Rwanda and Urundi, and they were also present in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Italians, to the extent that they could, tried to occupy Ethiopia and Eritrea, and were present in a portion of Somalia. The British were present, of course, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Nyasaland, in Rhodesia, and in Nigeria, and in many other places. The French, of course, were also present. And all these powers, even the Spaniards, were present in Equatorial Guinea, as were the Portuguese. And the whole idea was to use the resources, both natural and human, of the African continent, so that the partition of Africa was one that was designed to benefit the European powers. The partition was arbitrary. If you look at the nation states that we now have, or is it states that we now have with many nations in them, every other African country that we are talking about now is struggling to be a state. All of them, without exception, all of them. And this is what Pixley Kaisaka Seme was saying. How will we regenerate this continent? And it's instructive that he was talking at a time when the entire continent of Africa was under colonization, excluding Liberia and Ethiopia, all of them. And therefore, when in 1945, Africans were represented in Manchester, Kwame Nkrumah was present at that meeting, Marcus Garvey was present at that meeting, Jomo Kenyatta was present at that meeting, Obafemi Awolowo was present at that meeting. The drive was to decolonize Africa. And one of the things that amazes me is that at that time, these individuals did not have the internet, they did not have WhatsApp, they did not have the kind of communication that we have now. But it is amazing at how they were communicating. Even air transport was not as it is now. I was just recently reading the activities of one of the greatest Africans who, in my view, ever lived, and whom many people do not know about. The great Ghanaian James Emmons Kwegyir Agri, normally referred to as Agri of Africa, and how he traveled from the United States and went to many countries in Africa, traveling by sea and talking about why Africa should be united. And that was Pan-Africanism, the Pan-African spirit at that time. Of course, we then went into the era of decolonization. And the spirit again was one which was consistent. You had people from the Caribbean participating in the struggle in that regard. You have people like W.B. Du Bois saying that Africa must be free. A little later, people like Martin Luther King Jr., and people like Malcolm X, talking of George Padmore, talking about how Africa should be liberated and we should work with people in the diaspora. And then the agitation was there that we must regain our independence. And famously in 1949, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah is saying, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest will be given unto you." And I dare say that the rest has never been given to us. And even if it is coming too slowly. But it is instructive that at that time, the spirit was about the continent of Africa. We were conscious, the leaders were conscious, that Africa decolonized without unity would remain weak. And of course, Africa is weak. The weakest continent on earth is this continent in which we are, our continent. So the struggle for independence was everywhere across the world, across the continent of Africa. So when on the 6th day of March, Ghana regained her independence as Ghana, it was then Gold Coast. I think the most eloquent and the most passionate warrior for Pan-Africanism was Nkrumah. He said on that day, and again later, that the independence of Ghana means nothing if the rest of Africa is not free. And he meant it, because when Ghana regained independence in 1957, 1 year later, Guinea regained her independence. A year later, the French Sudan, or what we now call Mali, regained her independence. They signed a pact to create what they call the African Union. They thought at that time that that would be Africa in her embryonic days. And they invited Patrice Emery Lumumba in 1961, but of course Emery Lumumba was then assassinated in the month of January 1961. And he won. This is one of the things that always stands out in my mind. That Nkrumah, of all leaders at that time, was able to see that if we were not united, we would go nowhere. So in 1958, he summons a meeting in Accra, Ghana, of the then independent African countries and tells them, if we don't unite now, The neo-colonialist is going to ensure that we remain disunited and we remain small, and they are going to ensure that the neo-colonial project continues. In 1961, on the first day of January, again in Casablanca, Morocco, he tells his audience, let us unite now before each one of our leaders begins to get used to power, because power is easy to get used to. You who have been elected will know. Once you become a minister and you become used to people saluting you and opening your doors, if it happens for 1 month, you will find it very difficult if you lose your ministerial position when there is nobody to salute you and to open your doors. That is how attractive power can be. And he warned the people then. But the colonial project was alive and well, because as they were meeting in Casablanca, Morocco, there was another group that was meeting in Monrovia in Liberia. That is how Africa started splitting, creating two groups, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. The Casablanca group, which comprised, I think famously, Kwame Nkrumah was there from Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser was there from Egypt, Ahmed Ben Bella was there from Algeria, Modibo Keita was there from Mali. They took the view, unite now. The Monrovia group, comprised of William Tubman at that time. Emperor Haile Selassie was also in the Monrovia group. Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere was in the Monrovia group. They took the view, we want to unite, but gradually. Let it be gradual. So that when Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia convenes a meeting in Addis Ababa on the 23rd through to the 25th day of May 1963. There are two groups already. The Pan-African agenda is already being watered down. There is the Casablanca group and there is the Monrovia group. And the creation of the OAU was a victory for the Monrovia group. And I want you to, there were 32 heads of states and government who met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia on the 23rd through to the 25th day of May, the year 1963. And I want you to listen to all of those speeches, or the compilation of them. There is a compilation of them that was made in the year 2013 when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Organization of African Unity. And listen to all the speeches, and I pick out a speech from the leader of Central African Republic, David Dacko. David says, Central African Republic is so small that if we are not a part of an African Union, the French will come again. And they have come again. Mwalimu Nyerere of Tanzania says, we are not here in order to remind ourselves of how important unity is. We are here to talk about the unity of Africa. The host, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, says, it is important for us to realize that we must make sacrifice for the future, because a disunited Africa will never realize our potential. But the most passionate speech again was that of Kwame Nkrumah. He tells them, let us not leave here without one government, without one army, without one currency, and without having chosen a capital. And I propose that the capital of the new Africa either be located in Bangui in Central African Republic, or Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But I'm open to any other suggestion. And let us leave here once we have put together a council of foreign ministers in order to begin to work towards an African Union. That is Kwame Nkrumah. Nobody listened to him. We ended up with the OAU. And the story of the OAU can be told and retold. Some say that it was a toothless bulldog. Others say that it was not even a dog. But whatever it was, it cannot be denied that it made a contribution to the process of decolonization of the continent in many ways, complete with the establishment of the liberation unit of it, which was headquartered in Dar es Salaam in the United Republic of Tanzania, which was spearheaded the decolonization of quite a number of countries at that time. But the point that I'm making is that the Pan-African spirit at that time was about a united Africa. Because you will remember at that time that France never wanted to leave and has never left. It is always instructive that when the French left, they formed an organization called Organization for French-Speaking Countries. The British also created their own Commonwealth of independent nations. But what is instructive is that the Queen is always the head of those independent nations. I've never understood that. Perhaps the presidents do. The Portuguese, of course, you know, never left easily. Until 1980, when I was an adult, they were still fighting in Mozambique, in Cape Verde, in Guinea-Bissau, in Angola, and in Mozambique. The apartheid regime, of course, only left in 1994, and I wonder whether they have left. That is Africa for you. So that the fears of Kwame Nkrumah that if we were not united, we would have problems, started haunting us. He said that if we are not united in the Pan-African spirit, what is going to happen is that the imperialists is going to control us. They are going to emphasize our ethnic differences. And they are going to ensure that we begin fighting amongst one another. And as we do so, they are going to exploit us. And they started. In January 1961, they assassinated Patrice Emery Lumumba, and Congo has never been the same again. In 1963, they assassinated Sylvanus Olympio in Togo, and Togo has never been the same again. Then there were coup d'etats. Kwame Nkrumah himself, in 1966, eliminated via coup d'etat. All his writings, all his speeches banned, never to be read, never to be listened to until 1972, when Ignatius Kutu Acheampong rehabilitated him. Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, gone. In Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, gone. In Mali, Modibo Keita, gone. In Chad, everywhere, coup d'etats. Here in Ethiopia, 1974, if I'm not wrong, coup d'etat and the emergence of the Deg regime. In East Africa, Uganda, coup d'etat, mutinies in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania in 1971. All orchestrated because we were disunited and we were weak. The predictions of our forefathers and founding mothers that disunited we would remain weak came true. That is the history of it. So that today, when we talk about the African continent and we talk about Pan-Africanism, we must understand it in the context of that history. And you will remember that it is not as if Africa never realized or never recognized that our weakness would be in our disunity. We did. We did. Because regionally we were trying to integrate. We were in the East African community, we were creating the East African community. In South Africa, we were creating SADC. In West Africa, we were creating ECOWAS. In Central Africa, we were creating the Organization of Central African Communities. In the North, we were creating the Maghreb. Even in this region, we were converting IGAD into something in the nature of an economic community. We were creating COMESA. We were aware that Africa could only operate and operate meaningfully if we were integrated. We are not trading with one another. Intra-African trade is not anything beyond 15%, the lowest anywhere in the world. If you look at all our sectors and look at them, look at our agriculture, almost all African countries are net food importers. There is not a single African country that is in meaningful technology. Not a single African country produces a mobile phone. Yet the single most important ingredient in mobile telephony is to be found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Not a single African country produces a car other than assembling completely knocked down kits. There is no meaningful production of pharmaceutical products in Africa. And if there was any doubt, COVID exposed it. All African countries, the 55 of them, are waiting to either receive Sinovac from China, Sputnik from Russia, AstraZeneca, Johnson or Moderna. And we don't even know what they are because our bureaus of standardization don't know. If you ask the Ethiopian Bureau of Standards what they are asking us to be injected with, they do not know. They just believe it is a vaccine because the Americans have said so or because the Chinese have said so. Africa is weak. So that even this magnificent edifice, I suspect, has not been erected by Ethiopian engineers. When I see the signage in Chinese, I suspect it is the Chinese. That is how weak we are. That is the reality of our mother continent. It is because we are politically weak, we are economically weak, socially we are disorganized, culturally and spiritually we are confused. That is the continent in which we are today. And the question, therefore, what would we do continentally in terms of trade? In 1980, under the Lagos Plan of Action, and some of you have been ambassadors, some of you are now serving cabinet ministers, you will grapple with this on a daily basis. Under the Lagos Plan of Action, Africa sat down in Lagos and said, we are going to improve trade amongst ourselves. 1980, Lagos Plan of Action. Did we do it? No, we did not do it. We did not do it because the European Union was instead engaging us under the African Caribbean, the Lomé Convention of 1975, or the Cotonou Convention of 2000. Africa remains the only continent which is described as Anglophone. In Kenya or Uganda, where possibly only 20% speak the English language, we are Anglophone. In French, former French colonies, they are Francophone. In former Portuguese colonies, they are Lusophone. In some Arab countries, they are Arabophone. That is who we are. So, when the OAU met in 2013, they asked the question, what happened to the Pan-African spirit? And when, therefore, they met in Sirte, in Libya, under the tutelage at that time of Muammar al-Gaddafi, it was resolved in 1999 that the OAU be renamed and be referred to as the African Union, and it was launched, as you know, in Durban, South Africa in the year 2000. But one of the most important things in the 2013 was the speech of the then chairman of the OAU Council, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, here in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And I want you to read that letter, which I'll paraphrase, in which she writes an imaginary letter to Kwame Nkrumah. He tells and apologizes to Kwame, telling Kwame, we apologize to you because we did not listen to you. We are weak because we did not listen to you. We are divided into 54, 55, depending on whether the Moroccans agree that Sahrawi is a country. Nobody cares about us. And brothers and sisters, if you want to know how weak we are, and we are weak, look at how we are treated. Last month, the world met in New York. The General Assembly. When African heads of states and government are speaking, the hall is empty. Nobody bothers because they are saying nothing. And even if they are saying something, it is something that can be ignored. Compare when an African head of state and government is speaking and when the Prime Minister of Little Israel is speaking. They will listen because we are weak and disunited. So we have a weak continent because the spirit of Pan-Africanism disappeared. So the question that we can ask, what is the state of Pan-Africanism as we speak today?